The morning of November 2, 1944, began with a cold, metallic taste inside the radio operator's turret of a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. The aircraft was called Misfortune, but today, luck wasn't the commodity the crew needed, they needed a clear signal. Staff Sergeant Jack Moyle sat hunched over the N/Art-13 transmitter, its vacuum tubes humming a faint, angry sound that was barely audible over the roar of the four Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines. The air was thin and frigid at 27,000 feet. Jack could see the ground crew chief's breath, frozen into sharp crystals on the plexiglass of his own chest-mounted window, before his oxygen mask warmed it away. Below, Germany was a pale, cloud-draped quilt. Their target was the Leuna synthetic oil plant near Merseburg, a complex of towering distillation columns and vast hydrogenation chambers that supplied the Reich with the fuel it desperately needed. This was the 8th Air Force, and their mission was known as the Oil Campaign. The stakes were high, and so was the altitude. The problem wasn't the flak, not yet. The problem was the vast, paralyzing silence on the command frequency. The 381st Bomb Group was flying in the lead echelon of the 1,700-plus heavy bombers dispatched that day. They were exposed, deep within enemy territory, and entirely reliant on the command frequency for updates on fighter intercepts, mission aborts, and course corrections. Yet, the air was dead. Jack tapped the headset, nothing but static. He checked his power output, adjusted the frequency crystal, and tried again. Still silence. This was not unusual, German jamming was sophisticated. But today, the silence felt heavy, ominous, like the moment before a thunderclap. Jack knew their escorts, the P-51 Mustangs, were limited in range and had to turn back soon. They were about to be alone. First CTA, if you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The official operational procedure, hammered into every radio man during their training at Scott Field, was clear: if the command frequency was jammed, you maintained radio silence to prevent enemy triangulation and kept trying the established backup channel. To break that protocol was a court-martial offense, jeopardizing the security of the entire formation. The Misfortune was approaching the point of no return, and the radio silence meant they were flying blind into what could be a perfectly prepared German trap. Jack thought of the sheer tonnage of aluminum and flesh they represented: 100 men, 8 tons of ordnance. If they flew the predetermined route, they were heading into an unknown volume of airspace, trusting outdated information. The moral weight of the other aircraft, the slightly dangerous, the Witching Hour, the Vampire Lady, all relying on the lead aircraft's intelligence, settled on his shoulders. The central question of this mission, and indeed, of the entire air war, was suddenly distilled into a single psychological conflict: does procedure serve safety, or does survival demand defiance? Jack had only moments to decide if following the book was an act of duty, or an act of suicide. He reached for the unauthorized equipment tucked beneath his seat, a piece of hardware he had traded 3 cartons of American cigarettes for in a dingy hangar at Ridgewell. The doctrine of distance. By the autumn of 1944, the nature of the air war over Europe was defined by 2 central, unshakable doctrines: altitude and distance. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was an exercise in industrial logic, designed to dismantle the German ability to wage war through the destruction of key industrial bottlenecks, particularly the synthetic oil plants. These targets, such as the one at Leuna, were deep inside the Reich, requiring the extreme performance envelope of the B-17, which carried its bomb load nearly 5 miles high. This altitude, theoretically, placed the bomber outside the effective range of the majority of German anti-aircraft guns and the operational ceiling of most Luftwaffe interceptors. It created a psychological barrier: the bomber was untouchable, operating in a cold, silent realm where only mechanical failure or a lucky shell could reach it. The second doctrine was that of communication security. The entire mission rested upon the precise execution of the flight plan, which was coded and known only to command and crew. Radio silence was not merely recommended, it was a fundamental pillar of survival. Any transmission outside of designated frequencies and codes offered the Germans a vector for interception and, worse, a chance to triangulate the formation's position and speed, allowing them to vector in their fighters. The air crews were relentlessly drilled on this. The German signals unit, the Funkabwehr, was notorious for its sophisticated jamming and ability to impersonate Allied controllers. This created a culture of deep distrust for unauthorized radio use. The official message, repeated in every briefing, was simple: if you can't hear us, fly the route. Do not transmit outside the schedule. The equipment Jack Moyle used reflected this adherence to formality. The standard issue in /ART-13 was a reliable but complex high-frequency, HF, transmitter designed for long-range, coded communications back to command stations in England, not for tactical air-to-air chatter. Tactical communications used a separate, very high-frequency, VHF, system, which was short-range and line-of-sight. The German fighter squadrons, in contrast, were developing highly effective, coordinated mass attack tactics, relying on ground control intercept, GCI, and powerful, short-range VHF sets. They knew the Allied dependence on the long-range, high-frequency command system. The German propaganda narrative, which circulated even among Allied prisoners, was that the American flyers were robotic, incapable of improvisation, and could be defeated if their communication link was severed. This belief system was further reinforced by the heavy losses earlier in the war, particularly during the Schweinfurt raids, when a failure of communication and inadequate escort led to the destruction of 60 B-17 aircraft in a single day. The lesson learned was absolute discipline. Yet, this rigid adherence to doctrine created its own weakness, a predictable behavior that the German Jagdflieger, fighter pilots, could exploit. The Air Force had engineered an incredible machine, the B-17, and a robust system around it, but in doing so, they had subtly removed the individual agency of the crewman. Jack Moyle, now staring at a dead command channel, was confronted with the realization that the system designed to protect them, the doctrine of distance and silence, was about to lead them into a slaughter. The 96 flying hours of instruction he had received were rendered useless by the 20 minutes of German jamming. The shadow of the 80. Jack Moyle knew the history. He knew the B-17 was a fortress in name, but its defense was predicated on the massed firepower of the entire formation, the combat box. This interlocking field of half-inch Browning machine guns could theoretically shred any attacker foolish enough to fly a straight line. But the Germans had stopped doing that months ago. Their new tactic, the Sturmgruppe, involved heavily armored Focke-Wulf FW-198 fighters, often armed with heavy cannons and designed for a single, terrifying, close-range pass through the bomber stream. As the misfortune maintained its course, the radar room in the German 2nd Jagddivision Command Center was a hive of frantic, cold efficiency. Their GCI operators had already plotted the incoming formations. The jamming was a success. Their aerial scouts, flying high and fast, had confirmed the withdrawal of the P-51 escorts. The German plan was not a skirmish, it was an annihilation. They had assembled an estimated 80 fighters, a combination of the heavily armed FW-190 Sturmgrupps and the speedy Messerschmitt Me-109 interceptors, at an airfield north of the target. Their controllers were already vectoring them toward a pre-calculated rendezvous point just past the town of Kassel, a spot where the bomber formation would be transitioning, slow and steady, onto its final bomb run. The German message to their pilots was uncompromising: today, the oil flow stops. Every bomber must fall. Jack, listening to the static, looked at his commander, Major Evans, who was focusing intently on his instruments, trusting the last confirmed navigational point. The Major was following the book. Jack, however, could not shake the memory of a conversation he had with a captured German radio man back in England. The German, cocky despite his capture, had boasted about a specific vulnerability: the lack of secure, wide-band tactical communications among the bomber crews. He described their system as being highly localized and almost entirely reliant on the command link, which he promised they would sever. It was a detail that wasn't in any briefing book, a piece of material intelligence gained through a moment of forbidden, informal communication, a transgression of the same communication security doctrine that now bound Jack. He quickly pulled out the unauthorized piece of equipment, a small, unmodified SCR 522 VHF set taken from a downed fighter, wired with an ad hoc battery. This set, tuned to the fighter frequency, was designed for the P-51s, not the bombers. It was utterly illegal to use, as its transmission could not be effectively secured or coded by the bomber group. But the risk of broadcasting on a fighter channel was suddenly dwarfed by the certainty of doom. The official position was to remain silent and rely on the fortress's guns. The practical, visceral reality was that silence meant death by ambush. Jack had to find the escorts, who were now far out of range of the bomber's tactical VHF. The only way to breach the distance was to use the powerful, long-range HF transmitter, but he had to use a frequency and a code the German jamming system wouldn't recognize. He had to perform an illegal code switch, transmitting a simple, English-language warning over an unsecured channel meant for an entirely different aircraft, hoping to bypass the layers of German signals intelligence and reach someone, anyone, who was still listening. The fate of the entire bomber group now depended on one man's willingness to betray the rule book. The radio operator's forbidden skill. Staff Sergeant Jack Moyle, the 22-year-old radio operator of the Misfortune, was not a man of high education, but he possessed a particular genius for radio waves that defied the Army Air Force's Technical Training Command Manual. His formal training, completed at Scott Field, Illinois, consisted of 4 phases, totaling 12 weeks. He was taught primarily 3 things: how to operate the ART-13 HF transmitter for long-range coded communication, how to use the simple, line-of-sight SCR 522 VHF set for intraformation chat, which was seldom used, and, crucially, how to maintain strict cipher discipline and radio silence. The system was designed for reliability and security, not flexibility. However, the reality of air combat in the European Theater of Operations, ETO, demanded improvisation. Jack had spent his off-duty hours at Ridgewell Aerodrome, the base for the 381st Bomb Group, interacting with maintenance crews and salvaged equipment. He had a natural curiosity about the German frequency landscape. He knew that the SCR 522 sets on the P-51 Mustangs used a bandwidth that was outside the typical frequency range monitored and jammed by the German Funkabwehr against the heavy bomber formations. The Germans focused on the longer, strategic HF waves. The irony was palpable. The one communication system the Germans often ignored was the one reserved for the short-range fighter escorts. The piece of equipment Jack pulled out was an unofficial modification. He had salvaged the core transmission crystal and power coupling from a damaged P-51's SCR 522 and, working with a resourceful ground mechanic, had engineered a temporary link to the Misfortune's much more powerful, long-range HF antenna system. The result was an unstable, technically illegal hybrid, an HF-VHF coupling. It allowed him to transmit a signal using a VHF frequency, a fighter frequency, but with the amplified power of the bomber's HF system, giving it a range far beyond its intended line-of-sight limit. It was an engineering risk, unstable, and could easily overload the entire bomber's electrical system, but it was his only option. The psychological dimension of the moment was acute. The official Army Air Force narrative taught them to trust the system, to believe that their technical superiority and the sheer numbers of the 1,700 bomber string were their defense. This narrative was reinforced by industrial figures. In 1944, the United States produced nearly 100,000 aircraft, including over 8,000 B-17 bombers. German aircraft production, though resilient, was heavily reliant on the synthetic fuel targets they were currently striking. Jack's orders demanded he trust this disparity, trust the system that said safety was found in silence. But his own technical knowledge told him the German Jagdflieger were not being defeated by numbers alone. They were being defeated by speed and surprise. The silence meant they had surrendered the element of surprise. He could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the SCR 522 set warming up. He bypassed the complex cipher machine, ready to commit his transgression, a simple, unencrypted, English-language broadcast. It was treason to the doctrine, but it was a desperate plea for survival. The code of a single word. Jack flipped the switch. the radio operator's compartment was instantly flooded with the smell of ozone and hot components. The needle on the transmitter's output gauge surged precariously. He had only seconds before the jury-rigged connection would likely burn out. He took a deep breath of the thin air from his oxygen mask, adjusted the dial to a known but rarely used P51 tactical frequency, and keyed the microphone. He didn't use call signs, cipher keys, or prearranged coordinates. That would have been a waste of precious seconds and instantly alerted the Funkabwehr. Instead, Jack made his illegal code switch by sending a single, factual, desperate word, repeated 3 times, followed by a blunt piece of intelligence: Kassel. 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 Target compromised. Request vector check. Kassel. The word Kassel was not the misfortune's target, it was a transition point on the flight path, known to all pilots. But its repetition over the powerful HF antenna on a VHF frequency, a sound anomaly the German jammers were not tuned to catch, was the signal. It was a single, piercing shard of raw, unencrypted intelligence blasted across the German air defense network. For a terrifying, endless second, there was silence. The only sound was the furious thumping of his own heart. Then, a voice, sharp and stressed, cut through the static, miles away. It was a P-51 Mustang pilot, the leader of a turning escort group, his call sign Blue Leader, heading back toward the coast. Unidentified traffic, you are unauthorized on this band. Who is transmitting? Jack ignored the reprimand, pressing the issue with the crucial, undeniable detail: 381st. Leuna. German ambush past Kassel. 80 bandits forming now. Repeat, 80 bandits forming now. Confirm vector immediately. That number, 80, was the critical piece of psychological and material evidence. The Luftwaffe rarely committed such a massive, coordinated force to a single engagement against a protected echelon. It suggested a comprehensive, planned ambush far deadlier than the usual scattered harassment. Blue Leader, though initially furious at the breach of protocol, was a seasoned fighter pilot who instantly recognized the difference between panic and tactical reality. He heard the urgency in Jack's voice, and the specificity of the intelligence. The Mustang pilots were already turning back. Their mission had been to provide cover up to the Weser River, a point they had just crossed, but the sight of 80 fighters, a force that could overwhelm even a fully escorted combat box, was enough to trigger an immediate, unauthorized return to the fight. Blue Leader confirmed the transmission. Understood, 381st. Hold vector. We are turning for support. Repeat, we are turning back. Within 2 minutes, the sound of the P-51 engines, the glorious, high-pitched scream of the Packard Merlin V1650 engines, began to register on the edges of the bomber crew's hearing. The Mustangs were burning fuel they did not have, racing back toward the 381st. The German plan, built on perfect radio silence and a predictable flight path, was suddenly unraveling due to one radioman's act of defiant communication. Jack collapsed back in his seat, the illegal set sputtering, his fingers trembling, having committed an act of technical mutiny that had just earned his entire bomber group a second chance at life. The evidence of the attack. The sight of the P-51 Mustangs arriving saved the bomber group from certain annihilation. The German fighters, already committed to their attack vector, were in an irreversible position. They had planned a textbook Sterngruppe assault, a single, concentrated, high-speed pass designed to destroy the lead bomber formations before the escort could intervene. Their timing was based on the predictable speed and trajectory of a bomber group flying on a jammed command channel. But instead of an easy, unescorted target, the German pilots encountered the Mustangs, 15 minutes earlier than their intelligence predicted. The ensuing engagement was a violent, chaotic vortex of aluminum and cannon fire. The German attack was disrupted instantly. The FW-190 pilots, many of them flying the heavily armored Sturmbach variant designed to fly straight through the B-17's defensive fire, now had to contend with the lightning-fast, highly maneuverable P-51 escorts. The evidence of the shift was material and undeniable. The American bomber crews, previously blind and terrified, watched the fight unfold. They saw the Mustang pilots, flying aggressive patterns, engaging the FW-190 groups before they could even form their assault line. The fight was savage. The Mustang's half-inch Browning machine guns, firing armor-piercing incendiary rounds, tore into the less protected German fighters. The most profound piece of material evidence, however, was the failure of the German ambush's timing. The 80 fighters, committed to a pass, were broken up into fragments. Blue Leader, the pilot who received Jack's illegal transmission, single-handedly shot down 2 FW-190s and successfully forced an entire Sturmgruppe to break formation, scattering them across the sky. The bomber crews, witnessing this violent disruption of a perfectly planned ambush, experienced an immediate psychological transformation. The Germans were not invincible executioners, they were now victims of confusion. The official casualty figures confirmed the efficacy of Jack's transgression. The 381st Bomb Group lost only one B-17 aircraft in the immediate engagement, and that loss was due to flak damage sustained shortly after. The rest of the bomber stream, alerted and now protected, pressed on to the target. The German losses, documented in subsequent intelligence reports, were severe. 16 FW-190 and Me-109 fighters confirmed destroyed in the engagement, and many more damaged. The planned ambush, which, based on the historical precedent of unescorted deep strikes, should have cost the Americans up to 30 bombers, was thwarted by a single, 10-second broadcast. The specific intelligence Jack provided, the word 80, proved to be the most critical piece of data, moving the fighter pilots from a passive defense posture to an immediate, aggressive countervector. Jack had not just broken radio silence, he had successfully executed a tactical end run around the entire sophisticated German signals defense network. He had saved the lives of nearly 300 men. The ironclad doctrine of silence had met the unforgiving reality of a planned slaughter, and the defiant code switch had won. Second CTA, if you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The 381st Bomb Group pressed onto the target, their successful bomb run now assured by the timely intervention of the P-51 Mustangs. They dropped their ordnance on the Leuna synthetic oil plant with a cold, focused precision born of recent survival. Yet, the mission was far from over. The German defenses, though temporarily disrupted, were still lethal. The flak was heavy over the target area, a thick, black velvet studded with bursting orange shells. The bombers sustained damage, taking hits to wings, tails, and fuselages, but they maintained formation. Their psychological state, however, had undergone a fundamental change. The terror of the surprise ambush had been replaced by a grim determination, fueled by the immediate, visible proof that their desperate measure had paid off. For Staff Sergeant Jack Moyle aboard the Misfortune, the hours-long flight back to Ridgewell Aerodrome were fraught with a different kind of tension. His illegal transmitter modification had served its purpose, but the act itself was an unforgivable breach of communication security doctrine. He was no longer just a radio operator, he was a potential security risk, a man who had intentionally exposed the entire command structure to interception. He meticulously dismantled the jury-rigged connection, hiding the salvaged P-51 components back inside his toolkit. He cleaned the IN/ART13 set and logged a standard, uneventful communication report, omitting all details of the VHF broadcast. The silence he had broken was now the silence he desperately needed to maintain. Landing back in England, the crews were greeted not by celebration, but by a chilling, formal atmosphere. The moment the P-51 Mustangs had turned back, their unauthorized movement was flagged by 9th Air Force Command. The fighter pilots had, in turn, reported receiving an urgent, plain English warning from an unidentified B-17 on their tactical frequency. The mission was a success, the Leuna plant was severely damaged, but the post-mission briefing was dominated by one word: security. The air communications officer for the group, a major with a reputation for absolute adherence to protocol, was already waiting. He had two pieces of intelligence that confirmed a breach. First, the German jamming suddenly and inexplicably faltered immediately after the time of the illegal broadcast, and second, the German GCI chatter, usually methodical, had become frantic and confused at the same moment. Someone had sent a clear message that the Germans did not expect. The major addressed the crews with an icy tone, stating clearly that any compromise of the cipher system would be treated as an act of treason. The irony was profound. The action that saved their lives was now deemed a potential crime that threatened the entire strategic air effort. Jack stood among his crewmates, acutely aware that the major's cold, official fury was aimed directly at the man who saved him. The collision with reality was complete. Survival was now facing a court-martial. The investigation of the 381st. The investigation began immediately and was highly focused. The 8th Air Force could not afford a security leak. Their entire strategic bombing campaign was built on the premise that their communication was impenetrable. The possibility that a single bomber operator could broadcast tactical intelligence in plain text, compromising the integrity of the mission, was deemed catastrophic. The communications major, alongside a detachment of Air Force Intelligence, A2, officers, sequestered the entire 381st Bomb Group for debriefing. The first step was a meticulous audit of every single radio log and maintenance record from the mission. The N/ART-13 transmitters were checked for unauthorized modifications, and the SCR 522 sets were examined for unusual usage. The intelligence officers interviewed every radio operator, gunner, and crew chief, searching for discrepancies. They were looking for the smoking gun, the physical evidence of the illegal connection. Jack Moyle maintained his standard, terse report, command jammed. Followed procedure. Maintain silence. His training, which had focused on how not to communicate, now served him well in how not to confess. The turning point in the investigation did not come from the maintenance records, but from the Luftwaffe's operational failure. The A2 officers were analyzing intercepted German ground control transcripts from the day. These transcripts detailed the movement and coordination of the 80 German fighters. The log showed the German GCI controller confidently vectoring the attack group at 11:15 hours Greenwich Mean Time. Then, at 11:22 hours, the German transcript shifted instantly. The controller's calm, procedural language devolved into hurried, confused exchanges. The German term for fighter formation, Gefechtsverband, was replaced by repeated, frantic questioning about the position of the American escorts. This rapid, documented breakdown in German coordination directly coincided with Jack Moyle's unauthorized transmission. The investigators had their time frame and their evidence of disruption, but still lacked the culprit. The key lay in the fact that the Mustang pilots had turned back before the official signal. The A2 realized the warning must have been exceptionally compelling and specific. They returned to the fighter pilots, asking exactly what was said. The fighter pilots were unanimous. A B-17 voice, highly agitated, warned them of 80 bandits forming past Kassel. The specificity of 80 was the final piece of the puzzle. How could a radio operator in a jammed B-17, flying miles ahead of the escorts, know the precise, classified strength of the ambush force? Only through independent, tactical communication. The major, now convinced, ordered a final, exhaustive search of the misfortune and its crew's personal effects, certain he would find the unauthorized equipment or the written notes of the frequency. The confrontation and the colonel's verdict. The confrontation took place in the group commander's office at Ridgewell, a stark room with maps pinned to the walls and the ever-present drone of nearby aircraft engines. Colonel John B. Stevens, the group commander, was a man hardened by years of watching his planes fail to return. Facing him were the prosecuting major, armed with the German intercept logs, and Staff Sergeant Jack Moyle, standing at stiff attention. The major laid out his case: unauthorized transmission, breach of cipher discipline, use of salvaged equipment, and a plain English broadcast that compromised the security of the entire 8th Air Force. He demanded a court-martial, citing Regulation AR 380-10, which carried a possible sentence of 10 years at hard labor. He ended his summation with a powerful, if flawed, argument: "Sir, we cannot allow the lives of a few hundred men to compromise the security of the tens of thousands in this command. Discipline must be maintained." Colonel Stevens, however, was not only a commander of regulation, but a commander of men. He looked at the German intercept logs and then at the mission report showing the remarkably low casualty rate of the 381st that day. He asked Jack a single question, "Sergeant Moyle, you warned them of 80 enemy fighters. Where did you get that number?" Jack, understanding the shift in the colonel's focus from legality to intelligence, stood straight and delivered his factual, unvarnished truth. He explained his previous, unauthorized conversations with a captured German radio man, and the boast that the Luftwaffe would commit an overwhelming force when the Allied command channel was jammed. He explained the technical reality: the P-51's VHF system was the only wave the Germans were ignoring. He did not confess to the actual count of 80, but he confessed to the principle of the tactical assessment. His technical expertise was proof that he acted with intelligence, not panic. Colonel Stevens dismissed the major and sat Moyle down. The colonel then revealed the true, chilling extent of the day's planned massacre. Intelligence later confirmed the German goal was not just 80, but closer to 110 fighters converging on the bomber stream that day. Moyle's 80 was an understatement. The colonel picked up the major's regulation book, held it for a moment, and then tossed it onto his desk. His final verdict bypassed the need for formal disciplinary action. He recognized that Moyle had saved his group through a direct act of calculated risk, based on deep technical understanding of the enemy's weakness. The unspoken mandate. The official outcome of the investigation was recorded simply as insufficient evidence for prosecution. Staff Sergeant Jack Moyle never faced court-martial. The illegal code switch was not officially acknowledged, but its historical impact was immediately absorbed into the 8th Air Force's operational doctrine. Colonel Stevens issued no official commendation to Jack Moyle. Instead, he initiated a discreet, unwritten mandate within the 381st Bomb Group. He worked with his communications officer, the same major who had sought the court-martial, to quietly incorporate several lessons learned from the Kassel incident. The most immediate change was the introduction of a new, highly specific, and frequently changed panic word system. This system allowed bomber groups, when under extreme jamming, to broadcast a single, unencrypted word over an unsecured channel. This word, changed hourly, would only convey a binary status, ambush or clear. This gave crews a procedure that mimicked Moyle's successful improvisation without the threat of a complete security breach. Furthermore, the command began allocating resources toward improving the VHF communication range among the bombers, recognizing that the short-range system, when properly leveraged, was often outside the German jamming envelope. The psychological lesson was the most enduring. The command structure was subtly forced to acknowledge that rigid adherence to doctrine could be a greater vulnerability than tactical improvisation. Moyle's act did not shatter the communications security rules; those remained essential, but it did create a small, yet critical, crack in the Air Force's bureaucratic armor, allowing the cold, hard logic of survival to seep in. Jack Moyle himself was quietly transferred out of the 381st 2 months later, moved to a communications training unit in England. This was neither punishment nor reward, but a strategic decision to remove a man who had proven he knew too much about the system's vulnerabilities, while placing him where his knowledge of the enemy's signals tactics could be legally, and safely, disseminated. He never spoke publicly of the event during the war. The story of the radio man who saved his group through an illegal code switch became a piece of whispered, unofficial folklore among the bomber crews, a testament to the fact that in the brutal arithmetic of aerial combat, one man's disobedience was often the necessary price of collective survival. The legacy of the defiant transmission. The story of the November 2 raid on Merseburg became an exemplar in post-war analysis, not for the bombing results, but for the remarkable asymmetry between the danger encountered and the lives saved. The legacy of Jack Moyle's defiant transmission lies not in medals or official records. He received none for the communication itself, but in the profound historical irony of how military doctrine responded to genuine combat innovation. In the years following the war, as the Air Force Historical Research Agency compiled the combat narratives, Moyle's action was slowly, and unofficially, integrated into the lore of the 8th Air Force. His decision proved that the ultimate weakness of the sophisticated German Funkabwehr was its own success. The more perfectly they jammed the official channel, the more they forced the Allied crews to improvise, and the more they overlooked the unsecured, low-priority frequencies. The technical facts confirmed Moyle's genius. The massive power of the bomber's HF antenna, paired with the off-band VHF crystal, created a signal that sliced through the German jamming where the official, encrypted transmissions could not. The result was not just a saved bomber group, but a clear signal to Allied leadership that the true advantage lay in resilience and decentralization rather than just pure technical superiority. The moral weight of Moyle's action remains a poignant psychological footnote in the history of the air war. He was a soldier who chose the certainty of saving 300 men over the certainty of protecting military protocol. His was a sacrifice of military career for the sake of human life. He carried the burden of potential treason for years, knowing that the very men who shook his hand and thanked him privately could have, by law, been compelled to testify against him. His story distills the central tension of every highly disciplined fighting force. When does personal conviction supersede official command? Jack Moyle returned to civilian life, his wartime service record clean, but his conscience weighted by the knowledge of his necessary crime. He understood the stakes better than any investigator. The German ambush was not a technical problem, it was an existential one. He gambled everything on the belief that a simple, unencrypted word of truth, broadcast with enough power and cunning, would cut through the fog of war and the noise of politics. He was right. The 80 enemy fighters never completed their deadly convergence, and the 381st Bomb Group lived to fly another day, saved by the sound of a voice that dared to speak when ordered to be silent. The true cost of protocol. The immediate danger of the November 2nd ambush had passed, but the administrative consequences of Staff Sergeant Jack Moyle's action rippled through the 8th Air Force command structure for weeks. The tension between operational effectiveness and security discipline was never fully resolved, but the incident forced a re-evaluation of how intelligence was processed and disseminated. Intelligence officers recognized that their highly centralized system, while secure, created a fatal time lag. Information about the converging German fighters, available in various radar stations and aerial reconnaissance reports, was too slow to reach the bomber crews flying blind under heavy jamming. The true cost of the strict adherence to radio silence was measurable in human lives and mechanical losses incurred on previous missions where ambushes were successful. During the disastrous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid in 1943, where communication was equally poor, 60 B-17 aircraft were lost, translating to approximately 600 airmen killed, captured, or missing. This statistic loomed over the colonel's decision. Moyle's illegal broadcast provided a stark, verified counterexample. A tactical warning, albeit unsecured, resulted in only one B-17 lost to flak over the target, after the threat of the ambush was negated. The philosophical conflict was absolute. The major prosecuting Moyle represented the foundational belief that military victory was achieved through systemic control and the elimination of individual error. Moyle, by contrast, represented the survivalist ethos of the frontline combatant. The elimination of immediate threat takes precedence over the preservation of abstract security protocols. His use of the unsophisticated, repurposed SCR-522 set proved that the greatest technological advantage often lies not in complex encryption, but in finding and exploiting the enemy's blind spots. The German military intelligence, focused on the complex patterns of the Allied strategic codes, completely missed the simple, tactical distress call broadcast on a frequency they had deemed irrelevant. The lessons learned from the Merseburg raid led to subtle but profound changes in training at Scott Field and other communication schools. While the rules of silence remained paramount, instructors began spending more time on alternative communications methods and survival transmission techniques, terms that were vague enough to cover Moyle's transgression without explicitly endorsing it. The manuals were not rewritten, but the instruction evolved, emphasizing situational awareness and proactive intelligence gathering. Moyle's act did not just save a bomber group, it initiated a quiet, internal reformation of how the Army Air Forces viewed the balance between discipline and innovation in the face of a determined and lethal enemy. The lives of men were suddenly given a numerical value that outweighed the sanctity of the code book. The final word on silence. Staff Sergeant Jack Moyle completed his tour of 25 missions and was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, not for the communications incident, which remained officially unrecorded in his citation, but for his sustained courage and operational expertise as a gunner and radioman during the entire tour. He was honorably discharged in 1945. He carried the true story of the Kassel ambush with him, an unspoken burden of having successfully defied the law to save his comrades. His story illustrates the profound historical irony of how the American industrial machine, which armed its men with the most technically advanced equipment in the world, often had its greatest successes when that equipment was used in the most unconventional, almost primitive, manner. The B-17, a marvel of complex engineering, was saved by a jury-rigged connection and an unencrypted word. Moyle's legacy is a quiet but powerful rebuttal to the notion that technology and sheer numbers alone win wars. It emphasizes the irreplaceable value of human ingenuity and the moral courage to deviate from the script when life hangs in the balance. The 80 German fighters that day were defeated not by superior firepower initially, but by a sudden loss of the element of surprise, a loss triggered by a sound anomaly on their airwaves. The military learned its lesson well. The future of tactical communication in the Cold War era focused heavily on layered security and the ability to switch rapidly between frequencies and encryption methods, a direct attempt to prevent the kind of vulnerability Moyle exploited. But the human element, the willingness to take a risk when the system fails, remains the most potent, if unquantifiable, variable in combat. Jack Moyle's illegal code switch remains a vivid case study in the ultimate irony of the air war, that the voice of command can be jammed, the security protocols can be broken, and the most sophisticated plan can be ruined by a single, desperate, human voice choosing to speak the simple truth when all orders demanded silence. His defiance was not an act of indiscipline, but an act of profound, life-affirming leadership, a final, lasting testament to the radioman who knew that the most important message is always the one that saves the lives of the men flying beside you. The success of the November 2 mission was ultimately measured not in the oil tanks destroyed at Leuna, but in the lessons quietly integrated by the Air Communications Command. The incident became a whispered example of a profound, cold logic: if a protocol leads to certain death, that protocol is flawed. The security majors might have won the debate on paper, but the colonel's decision won the war on the battlefield. The psychological shift among the fighter escort pilots was equally potent. The experience of the P-51 leader, Blue Leader, who received Moyle's distress call, proved that trust in an unverified but specific warning from a fellow airman could be more valuable than adherence to the official briefing plan. For the remainder of the war, a small, subtle change occurred in how fighter pilots monitored their radio sets during deep penetration missions, an unofficial tolerance for brief, plain English distress calls on unsecured channels if the information contained specific, verifiable tactical data, like the number 80. This quiet transformation represented a victory for the decentralization of command authority. It was an acknowledgement that in the chaos of air combat, the man on the spot, the radioman with his ear to the enemy's silence, sometimes possesses more relevant, immediate intelligence than the command center miles away. The rules, which were designed to protect the strategic whole, had almost sacrificed a tactical part. Staff Sergeant Jack Moyle's illegal code switch forced the system to evolve, trading a tiny, managed risk of security compromise for the absolute guarantee of survival for the 300 men in the 381st Bomb Group. The integrity of the cipher machine was less important than the integrity of the mission itself. A legacy beyond regulation. Jack Moyle's story is a final, powerful legacy of the entire strategic bombing campaign, a necessary human footnote to a war dominated by industrial scale and technological superiority. He was never publicly celebrated for the act that saved his group, and the official history of the Merseburg raid on November 2, 1944, omits the dramatic details of the code switch. This official silence is, in itself, the final part of his story. The silence protected Moyle from prosecution, but also allowed the military to quietly adopt his innovation without damaging the foundational trust in its official procedures. Moyle's defiance became a template for necessary wartime transgression, an action celebrated unofficially by the men who lived because of it, but condemned officially by the men who wrote the regulations. His experience provides a permanent case study into the limits of bureaucracy in combat. In the end, the system itself recognized that it needed men capable of breaking its own rules to survive. Moyle, the radio man who saved his bomber group, carried the full, complex weight of this truth. He was a hero who committed an act of technical treason. It is a story that reminds us that the greatest victories in war are often found in the small, unauthorized decisions made by ordinary men who prioritize the immediate sanctity of life over the cold comfort of regulation. The bombers returned safely, not because of the rule book, but because a single voice dared to break the silence. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Thank you for watching. For more tailored historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.